security standards you're going to use, probably referring to an IEEE standard or an ISO standard or something like that. Okay, so we're talking about system properties and constraints, reliability, response time, storage requirements. You might have things about the types of I/O devices that you're expecting to interface with. You know, anything that isn't what the system will do, but is constraining your development and your implementation of the system. Okay, and when it comes to the development process, it might be something like saying we're going to use a particular IDE or programming language or development method. Okay, programming language can be very important if you're doing a web-based thing, because some users will not be able to support some web development languages. Right? So everybody would be able to support something with JavaScript, JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. But if we're talking about Ruby on Rails, which is what our second year students do their interfaces in, not all clients are going to actually be able to have a live version of that. So when I'm collecting clients for our second year students, which is a much more onerous task because we have 200 of them as opposed to 20 odd of you, we have to go through a process where they don't all work with the same client, because that would be just too much work with one client. Right? You can imagine how many meetings they would have to have for that many teams. But they have, typically we have about 14, 15 different clients, and 3 teams per client. But I've got to put out a call next week looking for clients for second semester. And then we get all these people who say, yeah, I'd really like you to develop this for me or that sort of thing. And I have to go through and check that they will be suitable for the type of project that they have to do, and check that the clients are going to be able to support a system that's built with Ruby on Rails, which not all of them can. Okay? Because typically, some people will have an ISP who already supports that, so that's fine for them. Others have the funds to buy into new services from their ISP so that they can do that. And others don't have the funds, don't have the capability, and we have to just say, sorry, we can't support that, because we want everybody to be working under the same framework. Oh, this is too difficult to assess the differences. Okay, so that's, but in general, that is an issue, that sometimes you do need to check that whatever you're the way that you're going to implement it is going to be suitable. And in many cases, the non-functional requirements may actually be more critical than the functional requirements. Okay, so if you've got that Mentacare system which is producing the report at the end of the month, if it takes a week to generate that report, it's just not going to be usable. Okay, the system would get thrown out. They'd stop using it. They'd find a more effective way of doing it. Okay, so that would be a timing constraint, a non-functional requirement, but you know, you've got some sort of constraint upon the performance of the system. If you've got to use a website that's meant to be able to handle large volumes of users, and it crashes as soon as 10 people are connected, it's useless. Okay? It's surprising how often that happens. Okay, so this particular diagram is from the book. I'm not going to go through it in detail. The point of putting it up here is to show that at the very top you've got non-functional requirements. You can break them down into essentially 3 categories. The product requirements, so they're things like the dependability and that sort of thing. The organizational requirements, so constraints that are put on the product by the organization that's going to be using it. And external requirements, such as regulatory requirements, ethical issues, legislative requirements like GDPR, So all things that you need to keep in mind. So the process of requirements engineering, essentially it's these 4 tasks. We have requirements solicitation, gathering, that's gathering the requirements from your clients. Requirements analysis. Okay, so they've said this stuff. Now, what does it actually mean in terms of how we're going to build the system? Requirements validation, which is essentially once we've done that analysis and we've got a semi-formal or formal specification of the requirements, have we actually captured everything that the client said that they needed? And requirements management is the process of managing change. Okay, so we talked in the first week about the fact that software engineering isn't just analysis, design, implementation, testing, deployment. There's a cycle. All software, almost all software these days, is constantly being updated and changed. Right? So you need to manage that change, and where in cases where you have formal specifications of requirements, that means updating your requirements document when the system changes so that it's not out of sync with what you've got implemented. Okay, so when we're talking about requirement solicitation techniques, we're working with the customers. We're wanting to find out about, first of all, about the domain that they work in, and then what they want of the system, and the operational requirements of the system. And typically you've got lots of different stakeholders. So we've got the end users, managers, support staff, engineers, domain experts, trade unions, and other external stakeholders. Lots and lots of them, lots of different types. When we're doing requirement solicitation, there's basically 2 approaches, either qualitative or quantitative methods. And this is going into now, crossing over into the social sciences, because we're interacting with people. Right? So if we're going to contrast qualitative versus quantitative methods, I've stolen this example from another lecturer who works in human-computer interaction, so design of user interfaces. And essentially what she's saying, what are the features of a perfect latte? So we might say, well, it's frothy and it's got a pretty pattern on the top. It's got a really nice smell, strong taste, nice cup. Okay, these are all qualitative aspects of the latte. On the other side of the table, you've got the quantitative aspects. So it's the proportion of the milk in the coffee. You've got to get that balance right. The temperature of the coffee. Not too hot, not too cold. How big it is. How much it costs. So all of these things, both the qualitative and the quantitative things, contribute to what a perfect latte is. And if we talk to different people in this room, you might have different opinions about what some of these values are, whether they are quantitative values, some of you might like a milkier one than others, or qualitative ones. So some of you might like a really strong tasting latte and others might like a weak one. Okay? But the point is that these ones here are things that you can put precise numbers to at some level. Whereas these are a little bit more woolly. Okay? Technically speaking, there is some measure of the taste of coffee. You know, there is a value, but I don't think the general public are aware of it. I mean, certainly I've come across it, but I wouldn't know how you would assign values to it. And they would be meaningless to me. Right? So, qualitative methods are particularly used in human-computer interaction. Okay? And most software systems have some aspect of human-computer interaction. There are several different methods: surveys, interviews, focus groups, diaries, and ethnographic research. And I'll go through each of those in turn. So perceived problems, though, with qualitative methods is, first of all, people say, well, stakeholders don't know what they really want. Okay, and sometimes that might be true, but you are building something for the stakeholder, and they might not know what they really want, but it's not clear that you will have a better idea. Okay, and it can be a bit arrogant to assume that you do. Stakeholders express requirements in their own terms. So, again, it's a bit of an arrogant statement. Yes, they are going to express requirements in their own terms, but it's your job, if you're doing the requirements analysis, to talk to the stakeholders and understand the terms that they're using. So remember I said that part of the process is getting domain knowledge. Okay, so you don't just go straight out to the customer and say, what do you want? First of all, you learn about the domain in which they're operating. That makes you better prepared for when you go out and talk to the customer. And don't assume that when you go out to talk to the customer, even if you have prepared, that you know everything about it. Get them to explain things to you, echo things back in your own words so that they can check that you have understood correctly and they can correct you if what you say is not what they intended, that type of thing. Different stakeholders may have conflicting requirements. Well, that's certainly true. Sometimes the end users of the system might have very different requirements to the administrators of the system, the people who are gathering the reports in the background and that sort of thing. And you have to find some way to balance those things. It's part of the job. Organisational and political factors may influence system requirements. Yeah. Okay. So you can see it as a problem, but really it's part of the working environment. Right? And the requirements change during the analysis process. New stakeholders may emerge and the business environment may change. Yes. Again, yes. Remember in that diagram that I had a few slides back? We had this spiral. Okay? And this indicates that it's not something where you're just going to do each part of it once. You are using, even within this section of the software engineering process, some sort of iterative process until you reach your document, the requirement specification. Okay? Things are going to change as you proceed. Okay? And, you know, in the worst case, you get halfway through doing your requirement specification and then the business gets taken over by another company. And then things will really change. Okay? It happens sometimes. And it might be a cause for abandoning the project, okay, because the new business decides that they just don't want to proceed with it. But it might just be an opportunity to adapt, change to the new business environment and do something. Okay, so each of those 5 different quantitative methods that I've mentioned at the top of this slide there, let's look at them in turn. Surveys are really powerful tools for collecting data from many individuals. So if you're talking about the user interface for something that's going to be used by the general public, so we're talking about the checkout system at a supermarket or a ticket vending website or something like that, you might want to gather a huge amount of data from a range of different types of people and classify it into different user groups or something like that, and then cater for them each as sort of separate sub-stories in your use cases and that type of thing. The way that you word surveys is critical. Okay? I've seen a lot of really badly written surveys where the way that they ask the question predisposes the user to a particular answer. You can have different types of questions in surveys. The most easy to analyse are the ones where you have either just yes, no, or a Likert scale. So a Likert scale is from strongly disagree to strongly agree on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, right? Or in a really limited case, 1 to 3, but it's always an odd number so that there is a neutral in the middle. Very occasionally you'll see one with an even number because they don't want people to take a neutral stance. Most users find that quite frustrating. So even though when you have a Likert scale, you can influence the way that the user interprets the question. So imagine if you had something that said, it's easy to book tickets with this system. Strongly agree to strongly disagree. It's difficult to book tickets with this system. Strongly agree to strongly disagree. Can you see how just by changing the way that the question is asked, you are sort of priming your respondents to a particular side of it? Okay. Now that's a really simple example, but you'd be surprised how often people do things like that. Worse than that, sometimes they make the questions themselves so wordy with so many double negatives in there that it's actually quite difficult for the users, the respondents, to work out what the question is asking, and they think, well, am I strongly agreeing or strongly disagreeing? And you know, they want to put a strong answer, but they might put the wrong strong answer to what they've got in their head just because the way the question is phrased, they can't work out whether they're strongly agreeing or strongly disagreeing with the statement because the statement has been written so badly. Okay, so they need to be easy to understand and use, and you need to have some way of getting appropriate sampling for a representative response. Okay, so if you were looking at, I don't know, the way that the university photocopying system, you know, the way that you pay for your photocopying and that sort of thing worked, and you just sampled the people in this room, you wouldn't call that a representative sample of the university photocopying system as a whole. Because you, as users, are going to be quite different to, say, a first year undergraduate in the humanities faculty. Right? It might be a useful sample of this particular user group if you sampled the entire class here, but it wouldn't be representative of the university population as a whole. And working out, when you're trying to target a large user group and get different diverse subgroups, ensuring that you do cover all those subgroups is actually a tricky thing. Particularly if you're doing something where you want to capture technologically literate people versus technologically relatively illiterate people. It's easy to capture those literate people. They're the ones who are going to be captured through an electronic distribution. You might pay for ads on Twitter or something like that. You'll capture a certain audience. But you're not going to capture the people who rarely use computers, might go down to the library once a week and spend half an hour on the library computer, and that's the only time they ever use the internet. Okay, so you need to think about, if you're going to use surveys, how you get a representative response for the diverse group that you want to cover. Also, surveys give you limited information. Okay? You can have open-ended questions in your surveys. You need to be really careful about how you phrase them again. So you could have something like, tell me about what you think the best features of the system are. And just have a text box for them to fill in. But honestly, if you do that, most of the time people don't fill in the text box. But if you force them to fill in the text box, they'll put nothing or something like that. Seriously. I see it on a regular basis with the student feedback, so you'll get asked at the end of semester to fill in surveys about all of your modules. In a class this size, I'd get text comments from maybe 5 people usually, right? And those text comments are far more useful than the ones that just respond, you know, they have a Likert scale which says the amount of work for this module was just right, too much, too little, the level of difficulty of this module was just right, too much, you know, that sort of thing. The numerical things give some sort of rough idea, but it's the free text questions that give the richness, help us understand what aspect of it was too difficult, for example. Or where people wanted more information, something like that. Of course you can always talk to me if you don't have to wait till the end of semester if you have feedback. Yeah? Okay, so surveys, great for covering large groups of people, getting statistically and significant results, that type of thing. Interviews are more suitable where your targeted user group is relatively small, and you go out to your users and you say, how do you envisage using the system, or something like that. You need to decide before you go out to interview users how structured your interviews are going to be. You can have very rigid, fully structured interviews where you have a set of questions and you want every single person that you interview to answer specific questions. That makes it easier to analyse because everybody's responding to the same things, and you know, so you've got some sort of consistency across all the results. But they might mention something while you're interviewing them that you actually think, oh, I'd like to know more about what you mean there, and that sort of thing. And if you've got a really formal structure, you don't get that opportunity. Okay? Typically in these cases you're working in really time-boxed constraints, and so you just don't have that opportunity to do the expansion. Semi-structured interviews basically give you that flexibility to follow up where there are interesting things mentioned, or something that you want to know more about, or something that the user wants to talk about that isn't in the question set, something like that. So it gives you that opportunity. And at the further extreme are unstructured interviews, where you have a list of things that you want to talk about, or a rough guide to what the format of the interview should look like, but they're pretty well open. And you might just go in and say, tell me about this new system that you want building here. Tell me what you think about it. No leading questions, just leave it to them. Okay, and that's kind of good. You can get a lot more interesting things out that way. But if you're really strictly sticking to the don't guide the subject, they can talk about whatever they want, it can be difficult to get the complete picture, because they'll focus on a particular issue that they have with their current working life, or something that they'd really like to be able to do with the new system. They don't think about the big picture. Okay, so if you're going to use interviews, my preferred way is semi-structured interviews, because it gives you the best of both worlds. The problem with it is that they're time consuming, okay? Because you're going to each user individually and spending some time with them, getting them to answer questions. Realistically, you're going to have a minimum of an hour per user. Not necessarily spending a whole hour with them, but just in terms of the time that's taken for the complete sort of preparing, getting to them, spending time with them, doing the notes and everything. So focus groups are kind of like a group form of interview, if you like. They're less intensive, so typically you're looking at around 10 people at a time, okay, in a focus group, who all come from the same user group. Right, so typically when you have a focus group, it's, you go to one section of the company, you take 10 people from that section of the company who are going to use the system in a particular way, and you talk to them, and then you talk to 10 people who are going to use it in a different way, and that sort of thing. And you encourage interaction in the group. Okay, so one person might say something, and then another person will chip in and say, what oh, do you do, is that your way of doing it? Actually, the way I do it is, and so really, rather than being there to ask questions and get responses, you take on a moderator role where you might seed them with particular questions, but then your job is to keep the discussion going and in some way focused, right? So typically here again, you've got semi-structured things and you're encouraging interactivity. Definitely though, unsuitable for delicate or sensitive issues, because there will be some things that people will not want to discuss in a group situation. So if you think that there are going to be any issues like that, you need to set it out at the start of the session. We are not going to talk about these issues. You need to be prepared to step in if somebody raises these types of things and say, valid point, but this is something that we'll talk about away from the group situation. I'll talk to you privately about that type of thing. So this goes back to what we talked about in the first lecture, that ethics are very important in software engineering. You need to think about them all the time. A completely different approach is to get your potential users, or the people who are doing a job of some sort at the moment that your system is going to replace, whether they're using a software system to do it or whether they're doing it manually or whatever, but to actually keep diaries of what they're doing, okay? And on their own, they're not going to be enough to build your system specification or your requirement specification, but they might be a really valuable tool when you're doing the domain knowledge stuff at the start. So if you've got some recording of the typical working day of your users, or of a subset of your users, it's really useful for you to gain understanding of how the system that you're going to build is going to be used. Okay? But they're only really part of the whole in terms of knowledge elicitation. Okay? And you might find it difficult to get your users to keep the diaries. Okay? So it kind of depends upon your situation. And then that brings us to ethnography. Okay, so we're really going into the social sciences here. In the context of HCI, it's the art and science of describing a human group, its institutions, interpersonal behaviours, material productions, and beliefs. And it's got its roots in the study of non-Western cultures, where the great British scientists went out to the Far East and just watched the society and then described the society. Okay? And then there was a famous case of a Papua New Guinea academic who came to, I can't remember if it was Oxford or Cambridge, and did a study of the academics in one of those two institutions, and for the benefit of the Papua New Guinea people, and basically characterised it as a very strange place to live, which is probably true. So the purpose is to gain an understanding of a world that you know little about, and in order to do that, you really have to encounter it firsthand, is the argument. So it involves both participation and observation. Okay, so these people go out and they actually live in those societies. So if you're going to do an ethnographic study of your user group, you basically go and get embedded in the company. And you sit there, you might be shadowing a particular user, you might actually be starting to do some of the jobs that are done in that company. It's very time intensive, and your own personal biases, of course, are going to come into play. Right? But for particular, yes?
Would that generally be done in an open manner, or would it be sort of like more clandestine? because if it was open, then probably people would behave differently if they knew who you were.
Yeah, that's a valid question. I think ethically it has to be open. Okay. And yes, you need to be aware that. Side thing here. So my research area is looking at human behaviour modelling, and particularly looking at modelling in military simulation, where we're talking about people who have quite formal specifications of the way they should behave, but they don't behave according to those formal specifications a lot of the time, right? And often when you start asking them about, why did you do this, that sort of thing, they will fall back on the military doctrine that they've been taught to explain why they made the choices that they did. And then when you probe a bit deeper, you actually find out, no, that wasn't the reason. You just did that because that's what you always do, or something like that. You're meant to always evaluate at least 3 different options for when you get into this sort of situation, but you didn't. You just chose that one that you always choose. You might have done it 3 times the first time you encountered that situation, but this time. And so there are techniques when you're doing interview process for digging down and getting at the underlying reasons. You do need to be really highly trained in interviewing, and I wouldn't claim to have that myself. I worked with psychologists who specialised in that area. When it comes to observing people in a workplace and you're sitting there, you're going to change the way they behave. They're going to be better behaved probably if they think they're being watched. So you need just something that you need to be aware of. But you can sort of say, if you notice somebody who's doing something and it doesn't look like there's something feels not quite natural about the way they're doing something, and you just sort of say, why are you doing it like that? It looks really awkward. And they might then say, oh, well, actually, normally I do it like this, but this is the way we're meant to do it. So you just need to be able to be sensitive to those cues that say, this isn't quite a normal situation, and then to actually dig down and try and get into it. But yeah, it's a difficult balance. Dealing with people is a difficult thing. But good question. Okay, so there's 5 techniques for knowledge elicitation, and I would say probably in most cases you're going to be using semi-structured interviews. Okay, but there might be situations where you do decide that you're going to use one of these other techniques. In particular, if you were developing a software system that was replacing some sort of manual system, or some sort of system that had lots of separate software parts where you were doing an integrated approach or something, this kind of approach here can be very useful, where you just go out and see people in the wild and work out what they're doing now and what works well about it and what works not so well about it. Because if you go away and you design something that's completely removed from the way that they used to do things, and I've seen this happen before, people just keep doing what they used to do alongside using the new system, and it actually slows them down because now they're doing 2 things at once. Whereas if you can integrate the aspects they like of the process that they use into the software system, they're much more likely to adopt it wholeheartedly. So it's a very valuable sort of approach to use in those types of scenarios. And it's just worth knowing your options when you're doing knowledge elicitation. Okay, so but once we've done the knowledge elicitation, we need to go to the requirement specification. So moving from these descriptions or these informal sort of analysis that you've got of what the users want and need, and write it down into the user and system requirements that we talked about. It's usually a formal document in traditional software engineering, or it may be a set of user stories if you're using an agile approach. It needs to be comprehensive, so to cover all aspects of the system. and understandable by both the developers who are going to use it as the basis for the development, design, implementation, testing of the system, and the end users. Because, well, if it's a contract, then they need to understand it. But even if it's not a contract, you're going to get much better feedback on it and be much more sure that it does capture their needs if they can understand it. You don't want to have to go through a reinterpretation process every time you talk to them about the specifications document. So it may be the basis of a formal contract. Okay? Now there are lots of different ways of writing down a system requirement specification. Most commonly still is natural language. Okay? The problem with natural language, of course, is that you can have ambiguity. So you need to be very careful and precise in your use of natural language. And very typically you will have a glossary very close to the front of the document, setting out key terms and exactly what you mean by them. Okay, so that there is no, somebody saying, oh, well, I thought you meant this when actually you meant that, and that sort of thing. Sometimes you see structured natural language where there is some sort of template or standard form that is used. And so there might be like particular sets of verbs that you use in terms of system performance or the way the users use the system. You might have particular nouns to represent different types of users. You might have, different aspects of the system always being referred to, and so you have it really closely spelled out, and any deviation from that basically means that you're doing something wrong. Then we go into more formal specifications, design description languages. It was fashionable in the 1990s, where you had something very formal that looked a bit like a programming language, and could be turned into something that was implemented in a programming language. Graphical notations, so these are sort of representations that show relationships between different parts of the systems and dependencies, that type of thing. These sorts of things don't usually these days have a place in a requirement specification, but they are used as tools in software engineering more in the design process than in the specification process. And then really formally we have mathematical specifications. Again, really fashionable in the 1990s, still quite a bit of research going on in this area, particularly popular with safety critical systems, where you want to be able to trace right through from requirements to deployment that everything is behaving exactly as it's meant to be, right? I know several people who do PhDs in this area, but I don't know anybody who uses it in practice. Okay, so the software requirements document in traditional engineering is the official statement of what the system developers have to do, right? It needs to have a definition of the user requirements and a specification of the system requirements. It's not the design document though, okay? It should be a sense of what the system should do rather than how it should do it. So when we were looking at the Mentor system, we were talking about the user requirement and the system requirements. Some of those system requirements started talking about how the system was going to do it. So you do see it sometimes, but on the whole, it should be what rather than how. Right, it's 10 o'clock.